I forgot to record it. So it was just the intro that we missed, so nothing important really. But so starting with the first item on the agenda, how appropriate. The first problem that we're trying to solve with components is, personally for me, is something that has really bothered me for a long time when I work with Drupal. And it will look something like this. So now we can laugh, but this is a project that I worked on, and trust me, it was not funny at the time. And just to give you some kind of context here, I was just trying to display a field, a link. Okay, hopefully you can find it there somewhere. Okay. And some people call this river of divs, right? And so, but as funny as it is, this is a real problem, right? When you are dealing with type of markup like this, not only is excessive markup, but it absolutely has no meaning at all. So now for us, this could be funny, but try to put yourself in the shoes of somebody using a screen reader to go through your website. Being in the government industry, right, we are required for our websites to be accessible. And so imagine trying to be somebody who has to go through each of these lines of code on a screen reader just to get to read a link. So that could be very stressful, obviously not friendly enough. So this is kind of the main problem that I was trying to solve with components, and components do solve this problem for us. So that's the good news. But there are other sources, other aspects of development that contribute to problems, right? The markup could be affected by blocks that we use in Drupal, views, custom content types, custom modules, the ambiguous classes and markup. The problem with something like what we saw earlier is that because the classes are so general, and they pretty much will appear anywhere on your website. So when you are working with, for example, as a front-end developer, and you are trying to theme a page or an item, you have to be very careful which classes you use, because those classes will appear somewhere else, and you could potentially be affecting something somewhere else. So it's really hard to find the right class that will not affect anything else somewhere else on your site. So there's more than just how ugly the markup looks. There's a lot of things that go into that. So components, basically the way I see them is components are breaking your website or your pages apart into pieces and individually addressing each of those pieces. Individually addressing those pieces in a way that you are naming each of those pieces with the unique names. You are determining the markup for that particular piece, and in return you get something that is more unique. It's got a unique name throughout the entire site. There will not be two components with the same name, so that eliminates the risk of regression, because you're now dealing with one piece that has a specific name, and you know that there's nothing else on the site that will have the same name, so there's no risk of you breaking something somewhere else. So they can work individually, but they can also work combined with other components. The beauty of the components is that they don't depend on where they appear on the site, what page, what section of the page. They're their own thing, their own entity. And so they will work, look, and feel the same regardless of where you use them, which is another advantage, is being reusable. You build a component once, you can use it anywhere on your site. You don't have to rebuild it again. So here's an example of a component working together with something else, right? Here is a project that we launched just late last year, I think it was. And each item that you see here is an individual component. But combined, you can make something like this happen. For example, we have the hero component. It's just a hero image with heading. In fact, the heading itself can even be a component on its own. We have a filter bar, a media card or a card with an image, some kind of tag or category, and a title, a button. And again, combined, you can make it. So it doesn't matter where I place these individual components, they will feel the same way. So they're not depending on anything else. One thing that we found out as working on this project is that the longer we worked on the project, the less things we were building because we were continuously reusing what we had already built. For those of us who worked on specific projects and we have a timeline and things, usually at the end of the project, that's when things get crazy and you're working the long hours and weekends just to make the timeline happen. In this project, I was actually pulled out of the project 2 weeks before the project launched because all the front end was completed ahead of time. I was able to start front end before back end even started. In fact, all the theming of this project was done completely outside of Drupal. There was no Drupal involvement. It was all done on the Styleguide. And when you bring it into Drupal, there's very little you need to do because everything's already being done on the Styleguide. And Drupal is just giving you now new data fields to work with, but the structure of the component remains the same. We'll talk about that in more detail. So I already mentioned some of the advantages of component-driven development. One being that you can break things down, and when you're dealing with a project, sometimes when you look at the whole thing, it can really be overwhelming. But when you break it down, you're really simplifying a huge problem. You can focus better when you're addressing one item at a time rather than a whole page. If you are trying to develop or theme an entire page of a website, it could be overwhelming when you look at the whole thing. Where do I start? How do I make all this happen? So rather than that, components allow you to focus on one item at a time and kind of ease the pain a little bit. Semantic Markup is what I mentioned before. We use BEM for all of our class names. BEM, if you don't know what that is, stands for Block Element Modifier, and it's a standard nowadays that allow you to create some kind of association within your elements, in this case, in your components. So when you have, in the case of a media item that I mentioned earlier, we can have the media item as the name, the global name of that particular element or that component, and within that media item we have an image, we have a title, we have a category. Each of those have a name association that relate to each other. So when you're looking at code, you want to inspect the code of a component, you know exactly where to go to find where that code was written because the name will guide you there. And we'll talk about, I'll show you also how the component structure works, so it makes it that even easier for you to work with. Here's an example of that media item that I was just talking about. So you can see there are 3 pieces here, and each of those pieces actually is an individual component. We have the image itself, the category, and the title. And when you look at the markup of this, that's what this looks like. So the top level item is media item. Anything within that, using the BEM terminology, is media item image, right? Media item text, the type, or you can say category there, and the media item title. So without even knowing where this code is, you know exactly where you need to go on your project to find this. You will have a component name called media item, and inside there you'll find all the code that this component requires. So you don't need to look around anywhere else. And so what we see here compared to the example that we saw earlier of the bad markup is that not only this is cleaner, less markup, but it's got a lot more meaning than before, because now this actually tells you what this type of component is all about. In addition to that, because you have more meaning with your markup, that's better for screen readers, but also for search engine optimization, because now things are using more semantic names, and search engines love that. So there's quite a few advantages there compared to this, right? Yeah, you can laugh now. It's okay. I'm still having nightmares about that, by the way. It's just, yeah, that Instagram link was not fun to work with. Right? Reusable components, that's another advantage there, is that, as I said before, the more we worked on this project, the less things we were building from scratch. We were just moving things around. And with the beauty of BEM, you can actually create what is called variants of your components. So that media item that I showed earlier, we have the image on top, then they have the category and the title with a simple CSS class like media item image left or something. We can move that image to the left and the text to the right of the image without having to rebuild that component from scratch again. Just making some changes with CSS. So BEM allows us to do that. And again, we are leveraging what we already built to be able to move, change the look and feel of things if they need to be. So just because things don't look exactly the same, that doesn't mean you have to build each instance of that. You can do that with simply adding modifier classes. Our back-end and front-end developers just love this. As I said before, on this particular project, we were able to start front-end development ahead of back-end development, which is something that you normally don't see that very often. Normally, back-end starts first, so things can be in place. That is handed over to the front-end developers so they can start theming what the back-end developers build. Sometimes by the time the work gets to the front-end developers, the markup that you want is not what you want, or the markup that you get is not what you want. Things don't actually were not built the way you anticipated they would be built. The markup doesn't match what you were anticipating. And so that creates problems because you may be reaching the timeline for launch, so you have to figure out how to make it work some way or another. The way we do with development components is we determine, front-end developers, we determine the markup, we determine the structure of a site, the breakdown of a site. We create the components ahead of time, providing the markup to the backend developers. So when the backend developers come, they look at our style guide, they look at what markup is needed for a specific component, and they build that component in the backend using the markup that we structure. So it really it makes their life easier as well, because backend developers, they don't necessarily have to know what the markup should be. But if they have the markup in front of them, they can now see, okay, this is kind of the markup that I need to spit out from Drupal. And so now that the component has been themed and built, it should just work once it's built on Drupal. So the clients love it. I mentioned Styleguide a couple of times, and I'll give you a quick example of that. As we are working on the project, we're making progress. The clients can actually see the progress as it happens, because we can provide them with a link to a style guide, and they can see each of the individual components that we are building as we're building them. So they don't longer have to wait until the Drupal site is completely done to be able to start seeing those things in place. In fact, this particular client here was able to do QA with the style guide. They didn't even have to wait for Drupal to be done. They were able to perform QA right on the style guide ahead of time of backend development. So that's another advantage, because they can actually see the components the way they look, but they can also interact with components if they require some kind of interaction. If there's JavaScript involved, where the component, when you click on a button, it does something, they can see all of that in the style guide. They don't care that it's not in Drupal yet. They want to make sure that the component works and behaves the way it is intended. So, and obviously our teams love it. Here are just some tools that we use, and as I said before, the tools could be optional. You can use any tools that work for you. In our case, we use what is called Yeoman, which is a generator that allows you to create kind of like scaffolding of your theme. We use Gulp to run tasks, repetitive tasks, like compiling Sass, compiling JavaScript, minifying files and things. NPM for Node. All of our workflow is Node-based. KSS Node is what we use for our style guide, but there are other ones out there, like Pattern Lab is very popular as well and works really well, so either one of those will do fine. Both of those work with Twig, so you can build your components in Twig, and then Drupal will take advantage of those. I mentioned earlier that whatever I do here applies to Drupal 7, and it does. In fact, you can build components in Drupal 7 with Twig. The only problem is that since Drupal 7 doesn't understand Twig, you have to copy some of the markup from your component into your Drupal template when you're ready to integrate those components into Drupal. With Drupal 8, you don't have to do that. Once you build them on Twig, then Drupal 8 will just read those same Twig templates that you created originally. And I'll show you an example. So, the style guide. This is the site that I'm talking about here that we built. So let me quickly do a demo, show you some of the components that we built for this site and how those components were put together to actually make up this full site. Are there any questions before I jump into the demo? So before I do that, I always forget to come back to the thank you slide, and so I want to thank you ahead of time. But I wrote a blog article, a blog series actually, on how to integrate components into Drupal. It's a 3-part blog series that you can find at mediacurrent.com/blog, and it goes into details about the whole process of building components, making them look and behave the way they need to, and then integrating those components into Drupal. So you're welcome to go through that series. There's also the Drupal8.com site. There's a recording of this similar presentation. So if you wanna get more of that, so let me come back to the. So first, this is the site. I'm just going to go through quickly because I do want to focus on the code of how this is actually work. But just to give an idea, this is what the site looks like. You can see some patterns of what I was talking about before, right? So if I go to the style guide, which you can find on this site, this here, don't get alarmed, this is actually a component that we built. But yes, so if I go down the list, you can see that all of these are the components that were built completely outside of Drupal. Right? Drupal was not involved in this at all. Actually, I can see the markup. This is what I was talking about, that us front-end developers can determine what the markup is, and back-end developers come in here and they see, okay, here's the markup that I need to generate when I build this back-end functionality. And so that's what that looks like. I talk about JavaScript behavior. So this is the style guide. This is not Drupal at all, but as a client, I can come here and say, okay, yeah, this is working the way I want it to work. So I can say that I approve of this component as part of my QA process. Right, because it's all the functionality and behavior is all here. So again, each item was built separately, but you can see the patterns here. Like in this case, we have this part slightly different than others, and this was achieved by simply adding some kind of modifier class or creating a variation, but it's still using the exact same original component that we built. Our slideshows, which are many of them, work just as you expect them to work. Let's see if this is supposed to shuffle the images. Here, I don't think that part was implemented there, but it is on the Drupal side. So as you can see, the incredible thing, this was, as a front-end developer, this was like a dream project to work on because I didn't have to deal with that nasty markup that we saw earlier. I could say, oh, this is the markup that I think will work based on best practices, based on what the requirements for mobile and desktop were. That all plays a big factor in what the markup should look like. So when you think of markup, it's not just to be able to render fields. There's a lot more that goes into that. Is how is the content going to shift from mobile to desktop? And what would the markup should be to allow for that to have a fluid and a smooth transition from mobile to desktop. That all has to play a big part on this. And as I mentioned before, even on design, as you're designing a project, a mock-up or something, that's where those decisions need to come and start. Is okay, so I want a mobile mock-up for my website. If I make it look like this on desktop, will the markup need to be updated somehow? Does the markup need to change, or will the same markup apply to the transition from mobile to desktop? So very, very important decision to take up front. Somebody raised their hand here?
Oh yeah, so looking at these like components, I could imagine using views, for example, and views, generate their own markup. So do you overwrite the markups that Drupal provides with the templates, and then so that it, like I'm looking at the markup here on your example site, it's very clean and not really what Drupal.
That's the beauty. Yeah, so good question. She's asking, based on the components that we have built, the markup looks nothing like what Drupal would spit out, and she is 100% correct. The way we address that is we create custom templates for each component, and that's where we determine what the markup should be. So what you see there, when you inspect in the code and see the markup, that's a custom Twig template that we created for that particular component. And by the way, on this website, we didn't use views at all. So, but same thing applies. Yes. Another question?
So is that the same as the headless? Is it the same as headless or decoupled? Is it basically the same thing?
I would say so, because you are completely isolated in Drupal away from the front end part. Technically, you can grab any of these components and move into another project, even if you like to. Right? So it's not that the components are reusable just within the same project, but you can grab any component and move it to a completely different project, because all the code that you have, all the requirements are encapsulated into a folder, and I'll show you that in just a minute. But yes, headless, decouple, that all goes hand in hand with this. Any other questions? So I can go. This is a long list of components, as you can see here. So let me quickly jump to the code. I'm sure a lot of you are interested to see how the pieces come together. How does this happen on building something like this? Because anybody can build a component like this on HTML and CSS, right? But how do you make Drupal aware of these components? So let me jump quickly to that. Let me see here. So I'll be speaking in LA this weekend. And so I'll be actually doing a workshop on this same topic, and I have a simple project that I created on component-driven development, and that's what I'll go with. So if you see DCLA, don't get offended. It's just for my next talk. But so let me start quickly here. This is our theme, and by the way, we have what we call a theme generator that we offer to anybody who wants it. It's on GitHub. If you go to github.com/mediacurrent, that's what we use to generate all of our themes. And with just a couple commands, you can generate a full theme with all the structure that we use at MediaCurrent for creating our themes. For example, we have our source directory. Can everybody see that? And that's where all of our working files go into. Here you see components, our global styles, layouts, our style guide, templates. This is the Drupal's templates that we'll talk in just a minute. But here are the components. And so I've created a sample card component. And the three files that you would normally use on a component, if you're working with Drupal 8, will be a JSON file. A JSON file is just to provide some kind of simple content for your component. So if I look at the JSON file, you have just a couple of variables, eyebrow, icon, title, and then some kind of stock content for that component. This later on gets replaced by Drupal. So we'll still use the variables in Drupal, but the content itself will be coming from Drupal fields. So that's kind of where things are going. You probably already see that. Here's our styles, and here's the markup. Right, so article it's got a class of card, and this is what I was talking about before. This is a placeholder for a modifier class. In the event that we want this card to look different somewhere else, we can achieve that by simply adding some kind of CSS class and change things around if we need to, without affecting the main card component that we build. Here I'm already making use of previously built components like the eyebrow, and if you're wondering what the eyebrow is, you'll see that in a minute. But so I have the eyebrow component, right? And what I'm doing here, I'm including it. So I don't have to build the markup for it again because I already built it here, right? And then we have the brand card, which is an icon, the body, and there's a read more button. So that's the way that is built, right? You have the markup, you have your CSS styles, and then you have your JSON for the data. The CSS here, if you notice, we use KSS Node, as I mentioned before, and these comments that you see here is what KSS Node reads to generate our style guide. So here's the name of the component, a quick description of the component, the markup, basically here we're saying where is the markup for this particular component, and we're saying it's going to be on the card.twig template. It's right here. And then this component will fall under the component section on our style guide, and it will be called card. Let me show you that in the browser real quick. So if I go to display, so here's the card component. This is the eyebrow, and that is, as you saw, it was its own component. Here's the eyebrow on its own with a couple of variations here. So this is kind of what the whole thing looks like, right? So this was all built directly on the style guide. The card was built once, and in this case we repeated it 3 times without having to build it 3 times. In Drupal, the way this was achieved is the card is a paragraph type, and some of the other fields are part of the paragraph type. You'll see that in a minute. The social media items were paragraph type as well. So this is what the whole thing looks like. So let's look at this in Drupal, and then we'll come back to code so you can see how Drupal knows about this. So this is Drupal, and let's say I want to edit this. So you can see that the information is coming from Drupal there. I didn't have to do any theming in Drupal whatsoever. It was all done in the style guide. Now let me show you what those templates look like so you can, yes?
So on the JSON file and on the markup, I'm assuming the machine names for things like fields do matter. And is that true that they would sync with the Drupal fields?
Right, exactly.
And is there a way, the process you use to communicate that with a site builder or developer to say, I've already done make this offer?
Yeah, it's all about, the question was between the component and the Drupal fields, those field names matter when it comes to integrating those components in Drupal, and the answer is yes. And as far as coming up with the naming conventions, that's something that you need to agree with your team. I personally like to add the, in a way, the component name as a kind of like a namespace for each item, and you'll see that in a minute. But yeah, naming convention is critical. In fact, naming things is so hard that you'll see a lot of things like card and banners and things like that, heroes.
So would the site builder really be looking at your style guide and trying to adhere to the naming conventions you assume?
Right, right. So let's go to the template so we can actually go into more detail about that. So we saw the templates, Twig templates. These Twig templates here, they're for the style guide purposes here. Drupal still doesn't know about these templates. So how do we make Drupal aware of these Twig templates? Just because they're Twig, that doesn't mean Drupal knows about them. Drupal will only look for templates in the templates folder, right? Right here. So any templates that you want Drupal to be aware of will have to be here. Or in Drupal 8, there's a module called component libraries, right? And the component libraries allow you to create a namespace for your theme or your project. And using that namespace, you can make Drupal aware of where else should Drupal look for templates, for Twig templates. So, so you enable the module, and in your info file, in your info files, here we have our component libraries. Right, and I'm saying the namespace that I want to give this particular theme is DCLA, Drupal Camp LA, and I'm saying the path where Drupal should look for additional Twig templates that I'll be creating for my components is either of these 3 folders here. So when Drupal reads or renders a page based on the namespace, it will look on those folders in addition to templates. And so now Drupal is aware of our components Twig templates. And let me show you how we make Drupal aware of that. For example, I have the templates folder. I'm going to open first the paragraphs template for a sponsor. This is the card component. Here I'm all I'm doing is I'm including the sponsor.twig card component. Well, it's the card component, but it's sponsored. It's called sponsored. I'm just including that there, and just by doing that, and if you look, it says add this CLA. That's the namespace. So Drupal knows, okay, add this CLA. It could be one of those 3 folders that I showed earlier. So I will see if we can find this template there, and then I am using the same variable. So if I expand the sponsor component, I'm sorry, JSON file, I have eyebrow, icon, title, and I'm repeating it 3 times here, right? So here I am using the same variables that you saw on the JSON file, except this time I'm not passing stock content or dummy content. I'm passing the fields that I created when I created a paragraph type in Drupal. Okay, so if I go back to Drupal and I inspect the paragraph type for the name, I didn't use the best naming convention here, but let me just, this is the sponsored card basically. This is the, was that, hold on for a second here, I'm seeing sponsor, no, it is the sponsor, Twig. I did confuse myself when I created this. So this is the content type that I can. So see where, that's what I was talking about. Not using naming convention for your fields is, I said field sponsor image, field sponsor body, field sponsor social icons, field sponsors. This is the card here. And these are 2 entity references, which are referencing the paragraph types that I created. Right, same as the sponsored. The sponsor is referencing the card paragraph type. So if I go to paragraph type card, these are the fields: field card body, field card eyebrow. So the name it just makes sense all together. So when you're if you're dealing with hundreds of components, you want to make sure that you have names that make sense to you as well. Because otherwise, if you just use field image, there'll be a point where you're not longer going to be able to use that name because it's already being used. So you end up using names that make no sense at all, like field image 1. What does that mean? So in this case, I rather use names that, by tying it into the name of the paragraph type in this case, I have more options, more flexibility on the names for my components. So, so going here, I'm saying I'm including the sponsors component, which is 3 cards. I can literally grab, if going back to the clean markup that the young lady asked about there, I can actually delete this here, and this will still work. In fact, all of this will still work. So talk about clean markup. We're completely getting rid of all of Drupal junk, right? However, we found that by removing a lot of those extra stuff that Drupal provides, we're sometimes getting rid of the quick edit abilities in Drupal and other things that Drupal provides. So while we would like a clean markup, we can get it, but we also want to be able to take advantage of the Drupal functionality that is provided by Drupal out of the box. So we'd rather leave that there. Our markup will still be clean. In fact, if I inspect the component, there is. So future sponsor, and here we have the left, which is the image with the intro, the right, which is our sponsor cards. Here is each of the cards. So as you can see, the markup is still there, and the naming convention is still there. So you can see exactly how things are related to each other. The only thing that Drupal then adds all of this extra stuff here, but that's okay. We don't have to care about that. That's just for Drupal to be able to work properly. So people want to be able to quick edit a paragraph or something, they'll still be able to. And we're still achieving our clean markup for the component itself. Whatever surrounds Drupal or the component, it doesn't really matter when it comes to that. As long as our markup still reflects the naming convention and type of structure that we want, then that's what really matters to us. So I said before that when you're inspecting something, and you say, okay, I want to edit something on this component. Where do I go to edit this? When you're working on a theme like this and you have already structured your theme file structure the way it's supposed to be, we use SMAX, some version of SMAX for structuring our theme file system. So as you can see here, we have the source file. Everything gets compiled through Gulp into a distribution folder. This is where all the working files are. I'm sorry, the compile files. And so when you come to the components folder in sources, this is where you can say, okay, future sponsors, this is what this component is here. Future sponsors, or this is a card. Then I can go to the card component and I'll have everything that I need on just this one folder. This is what I was talking about, making it portable. You can literally grab this card component folder and move it to another project completely different, another Drupal 8 project in this case. And it will still look and behave the same way because you have all the required files that make up this one component. So I talk about using these modifier classes, and why would you want to do that? Let me show you. If I inspect the card component itself, right? So here's the card component. You see that by default it uses the card class because I will have styles for my card that are global. That no matter where the card appears, there are some styles that will still apply. Things like maybe if it has a border or round corners around the borders. But there may be specific styles that if I have the card on a sidebar, maybe the background of the card will be different, or the text color may be different, or the size. So when I include this card component in my future speakers component, where did it go? Give me 1 second. Sponsors, I think it is. Here we go. Okay, there we go. So here's the sponsor. So this is the combination of the 3 cards, right? Just on their own, and I'm including the card component here. I'm saying for item and items, which is here. I'm saying for each item, for each instance of this card, include a card. So every time the loop goes through one instance, it'll include a card instance, right? But at the end, I'm passing these classes, and I'm saying when you include the card, also append this class to the card. In this case, future sponsors card, because when I look at here, I have global styles for my card, but in the future sponsors section, I may want to do something different with this card. So by having this class, unique class, to just this one section of the site, I'm able to do that. I'm able to create those variations of that card component without affecting the original card that I created. So that's what the modifier class placeholder is for. And so that's what the flexibility comes in, is that if you were not to use a modifier class like that, you will have to start using namespaces based on the wrappers of your component. You don't want to do that. You want things to not be depending on anything around them, because by doing this here, my card is still not depending on the future sponsors section. My card is just saying if it's here, add this class. If it's not, just keep the class of card, so that it's not depending, because I may want to move this card elsewhere, somewhere else, and that won't be affected by where that card is placed. So that's kind of the overall idea of building with components, that the flexibility that you get, all the benefits, not just clean markup, but also all the things you can do with the components is incredible. Now, going back to Drupal 7, as I said before, you can still do this with Drupal 7, but it will take a little bit more work. As an example here, if I'm building this component here in Twig, again, even in Drupal 7, you can use Twig for your components. But when it's time to move this to Drupal, I will need to copy the markup that I created here, and let's pretend that this is not Twig template, but these are PHP templates. Then you will have to kind of rewrite the markup all over here again on your PHP template. And as long as you provide the right fields from Drupal, then it should work. You don't have to worry about the styles or anything because those will come with the markup that you are working with. Here is the overall component to make it look like this in Drupal. I created a content type called sponsors, and here's how everything comes together. Create some variables.
I have a question.
Yes.
So if you're using NoSQL, have you used that, or are you still using relational databases?
I have not, but as long as you provide the sources of data to the component, it doesn't matter what that source is, right? For example, we are developing right now a site using Jekyll for the front end and Drupal on the back end. And Jekyll doesn't use a database either. It just uses YAML files for your data storage. So I'm creating data objects in Jekyll to pass that data to the component. So,
Okay. Yeah, so I understand that. But as far as the views, they have problems working with NoSQL. So have you had experience with that?
I have not, I'm sorry.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry. Any other questions? Or anybody can answer that question if anybody has had experience with that? No, okay. So this may look a little confusing and intimidating, but all I'm doing because this is a render array that I'm creating to pass it to the component include here. So you can see sponsors. All I'm doing here is I'm basically kind of doing the same for loop through the cards to create this sponsors variable array. So I just can pass it here. I could have done this down here, but it just looks cleaner when you isolate this on its own and then just pass it as a single value here. Yes?
So going back to that JSON filler content that you had, the JSON keys, like match exactly the keys that you have here for your key libraries where the image and content fits all image. Is that how the component knows to use that dummy content?
Well, and the question was that the usage of the variable and the key and value is provided here to the Drupal template, and is that how the JSON node or Drupal knows how to use the content on the component? Well, the JSON is only used on the style guide.
That's what I mean. Does the style guide know because it's
Right, but that's I think I know what you're asking. So how does the style guide know which data to use for the component? As long it's magic. As long as the JSON file has the same name as your Twig file, so as long as your JSON file has the same name as your Twig file, it knows to automatically use that JSON file. So if you notice, each of the JSON is the same name as the Twig template. So that's how it knows to go and use that data. On Drupal, obviously, we're not using the JSON at all. In Drupal now, we are using the Drupal fields, as you can see here. So, any other questions? How much time do we have?
Minus 2 minutes.
Minus 2 minutes. Okay. Wow.
That's all about it.
Oh, excellent. Okay. Well, I'll be happy to answer all the questions if you have. Yes, sir.
Do you have can you show the implementation of the Jekyll front end with the same?
Oh, okay. Somebody wants to see the Jekyll things that we are working on. So it's still work in progress. So let me see if I can get to that real quick.
Is this cheese?
So there's one more thing that I want to mention. In the example that you were saying where you were appending a class as a modifier,
Yeah.
isn't that in theory, you're still making that change based on it being in the field sponsors component? So if you made that change to that for example, in that component only, then I can't take that specific component and move it out without calling it field sponsor. So it seems like you should still make a modifier class off of the component itself and not, you know what I mean?
Right, and that's what the card class is, that generic class for the component.
Right, but if you make a modification to that and you want to move that modification somewhere,
Oh, somewhere else, I see what you mean, yes.
yeah, I can still tie it to that.
So you can, right, so you can add as many modifier classes as you want. For example, you saw the cards here. Let's say I want to turn these cards to maybe a lighter color. I can have a modifier class called card light.
Right.
And then I can grab that class, and if I move this component somewhere else, I can just make sure that I bring that card light class as well, so it'll bring up that modification. So yeah, good point. The Jekyll thing, just a few minutes, right? It's really no different. If I look on sources, the difference here is that Jekyll uses includes is a concept of include. And it's the same concept that you see in Drupal and Twig, where you can include other pages onto a page. So here in the includes, we just created a components folder, and the rest is the same. The difference here is that we don't use JSON. I'm using a data object. See where it says site data, and the data object is up here. Under components, we create a data object for each of the different components that we are creating. We can even combine the data object from one component to another. It doesn't matter. I could just say here, instead of breaker, if the article, for example, see this article data object here, if that article has the same fields that I need for this component, I can just say, okay, just give me the fields from the article data object, and then replace them here. But yes, and then through Gulp, you compile everything, and that's how things become the components. But the concept itself, the structure and everything else pretty much remains the same as you saw in Drupal and Styleguide. So, any other questions?
Thank you.
Yes?
I have one question. This may be kind of a basic question, but I mean, Drupal gives you a lot of flexibility, like rearrange fields in the admin interface and with views and stuff like that. I mean, to what extent, if I would make a change that I would normally make by just dragging and dropping, to what extent do I have to go to make a lot of changes here? Do I lose that admin flexibility with this approach, or are there ways to kind of keep that?
Yeah, so the question was that Drupal offers a lot of flexibility in the sense of kind of moving fields around if I need to through the UI, dragging and dropping fields, and to what extent do I lose that flexibility? Do I need to go into the template to make those adjustments? How's that?
Yeah.
That's pretty good. Okay, so in a sense, you kind of do lose that flexibility, because if you wanted to move some of the stuff around, doing it on the template on the UI is not going to do it for you, because the template itself has been coded with that. So yes, that is something that you need to kind of figure out. If it's something that you anticipate to be done to an extent, you can add logic to your component saying if this field exists here, render it. Otherwise, don't render it. But if it exists here, render it here. So, but again, it all depends on the use case. But yeah, that would be. I would say that would be a disadvantage. Now, chances are, and I don't know about the project, but at least most projects that we work with, once something is done, we have markups, we have designs already we agreed to, so things don't change so much. And if they do, this is a whole new development cycle to go through. Oh, yeah, good question.
Oh.
Yes.
In Drupal 7, and to go off that question, you had the ability to sort of render certain fields, and then you'd render the content, it would render all the rest of the fields. Is there any kind of, I guess you could put that in the logic to just, let's say you have some kind of technical software page or something, and you have a bunch of specs that just spit out maybe is there a way that you can kind of spit out the rest of the fields in an area?
Would that make the whole content for that particular area, or
Just say at the bottom, print out the rest of the fields.
I mean, are you talking about Drupal 7 or Drupal 8? Because in Drupal 8, there's filters you can use, like, you know, content without, and specify the fields that you don't want to print. But then at the bottom, you can include those fields again. That would be one way. Do you have any other ideas on that? I mean, I'm pointing at you because I know you know this. But yeah, in Drupal 8, there's ways you can say, you know, you specify your render content and then pipe without, and then specify the fields that you don't want to print. Let's say for the top part of the page, and then at the bottom you can say you can even specify the individual fields that you do want to print, or find out the best way to print or render those fields at the bottom. Yeah. Yes.
It looks like in this example you've got one style guide per site. Have you worked with this approach where you have, say, a large company that has lots of different sites, different visual properties, but that are following essentially the same style guide? That you've got a common style guide that kind of sits.
Yeah, more kind of like a
from multiple different sites.
so one style guide for multiple properties.
Right, multiple Drupal properties or Drupal plus other CMS.
I mean, it's definitely doable. I personally have not done that myself, but there's ways where you can do like a base theme and then have a sub theme for each of the different properties. Those can literally, the base themes can, the sub theme can inherit from the base theme, and so I would think that the style guide should be available for all the properties that you have. Well, if there are no more questions, thank you very much for your time, guys. Appreciate it.